Hi everyone, welcome to today's video. My name's Stephanie and today I am so excited to finally share ILNP's Twisted and Thorns collections. Twisted is ILNP's 6-piece Halloween lineup featuring these color-shifting, multi-chromatic magnetics, while the Thorns collection is a little quad in their studio color line featuring these jewel-toned Crellie shades. So as always, I will save more of my thoughts for the end of the video. For now, let's just get into the swatches. The first polish in the collection is Madhouse, and this is described as a green magnetic polish with purple shimmer. So it definitely does have a green magnetic pigment, but I would say the base of the polish itself is more of a darkened teal color, and as expected, it's in the typical ILNP magnetic formula where it's very pigmented, but a little bit on the jelly leaning side. So you can see I got a little bit of a bald spot near the tip of my nail, but because the shade is pretty dark and just very pigmented, I got really great coverage in just 2 coats, where I would call it fully opaque for me, but of course that can depend on your nail length, your application, and your personal preference. I love the contrast of the green magnetic shimmer against the purple background shimmer. It's giving Joker vibes. It is just so perfect for Halloween, and you definitely get more of that teal base color coming through with the cat eye effect as opposed to the velvet or unmagnetized styles. Next we have Radioactive, and this one is also described as a green magnetic polish with vivid orange shimmer. So I'm assuming by their description they're talking about the magnetic pigment being green, and it definitely is, but it is a little bit more chartreusey, a lot more yellow leaning compared to Madhouse, which don't worry, I'll be showing a comparison later. Though now I am starting to wonder if they did use the same magnetic pigment, but it just looks very different because of the different colored background shimmer and base color, where the base in this one I would say is either black or more of a very dark charcoal color. It was pretty sheer on the first coat, a lot more sheer than I was expecting, but it did build up to be fully opaque for me in 2 coats again. This one was also super shifty, where the background went from red to yellow and the magnetic went from green to teal, and you definitely see more of those colors when you do the cat eye as opposed to the velvet style. Then we have Overload, which is a black magnetic polish with multicolored shimmer. This one was a favorite from the collection. I thought it was just so beautiful, even though it is pretty simple, I guess. It's not filled with the same color shifting, multi-chromatic pigments as the rest of the collection, but it's still very colorful and sparkly with the multicolored shimmer. So it really does give this beautiful rainbow effect without being holographic. And I was also really impressed with how well each of those colors stood out against the black base, because as you can see, it is very pigmented, again reaching full opacity in 2 coats. And like I mentioned, this one is a little bit more simple, just having a plain silver shimmer, but I don't know, it's still really pretty. The next shade we have is Electroshock, and this is described as a teal magnetic with a molten gold shimmer. I was a little on the fence about this one because I loved how it looked in the bottle, but then once I magnetized it, I wasn't super crazy because I just don't love that gold background shimmer. I guess it's the shade of yellow that I don't find super flattering on me. So, you know, this wasn't my personal favorite from the collection, at least not in the cat eye effect. I definitely enjoyed this one a lot more in the velvet or even unmagnetized state because you just get more of that teal colored shimmer and less of the gold. So I just really loved how this one transformed depending on the technique that you use. But even aside from my personal preference, I think I would say that this was the weakest from the collection because it had the most sheer formula, where even though the base was black or a really dark gray, it was also the most sheer, so it needed 3 coats. And next up we have Mood Ring, which is the pink magnetic polish with a glowing blue shimmer. I actually had a hard time telling what the base color for this one was underneath all of that blue shimmer. I would guess it's a very dark purple, maybe indigo kind of color, but whatever color it is, I would say that the base is definitely on the more muted side. Obviously what shines is the shimmer in this one, having that bright cobalt blue background shimmer with a brighter glitter hot pink magnetic. It is just so pretty, and even though these are multi-chrome kind of shimmers, or at least duochromes, the shifts in this one are, I would say, a little bit more subtle, where the blue goes to a slightly darker indigo and the pink goes to a coppery orange. So still shifty, just not as colorful as the first two magnetics, for example. And no surprise, I loved this in the velvet effect. And rounding out the collection is Distorted, which is a blue magnetic with a flashing orange shimmer. This is another one that I think I would describe as a very darkened teal base color. You can see a little bit of that teal kind of undertone here on the first coat where it is a little bit more sheer, but because it's so dark, once you do build it up in two coats, it kind of just looks black, especially underneath all of the shimmer. Based off of the initial promo photo I saw of this, I was really excited because I loved the contrast of this cobalt blue against this fiery orange. Granted, the initial promo was in the velvet style, which I do think looks a little bit better. With the cat eye effect, for some reason it just fell a little flat for me. I guess it's because of the background shimmer just not being as glowy, so it just didn't stand out as much. Don't get me wrong, it's still beautiful, just in a slightly more subtle way. And lastly, I have a couple of collages of my thumb swatches for these. So this first one is in the cat eye effect, which I feel like you can definitely tell a very strong difference in all of them basically, but they do start to blend in a little bit more once you do the velvet effect, where I would say Madhouse, Radioactive, and maybe even Electroshock, fall into that greenish yellow category, while Mood Ring and Distorted obviously have a stronger blue color going on. And keep in mind, photos of the velvet effect don't ever really do it full justice. As a first glance, they are in the same kind of color family, but you can see more of a color shifty difference in real life. And lastly, here they are unmagnetized, which I would say look even more similar to each other because they are a little bit more flat and less color shifty. Then moving on to the Thorns collection, the first shade we have is Dahlia, which is described as a dark maroon. So ILNP didn't specify whether these shades were jellies or Crellies. I personally think I would call them Crellies just because they are incredibly pigmented. As you can see here on the first coat, there is a little bit of squishiness going on, especially around the edges of my nail or around my cuticle especially, but I could not make out my visible nail line at all, mainly because these colors are obviously so incredibly dark, but I do think the actual red color of this was the most noticeable compared to the other shades in the collection. Unlike the next polish, which is called Nightshade, and this one is described as a blackened eggplant, and it is definitely a very blackened purple. I don't know if I just had a little extra polish on the brush for my first coat here. You can see a little bit of that glassiness and that purple color coming through on certain swipes, but it is so incredibly dark and pigmented that it is fully opaque in just two coats, and you can barely tell that it's purple. It might be a little bit more noticeable in real life, but this is definitely the darkest from the quad. And then we have Midnight Ink, which is described as a midnight navy. Not to sound like a broken record, but this was another super pigmented, Crelly kind of formula. I would say a little bit more similar to Dahlia, for example, where that first coat, you can definitely see that color. It's not the most even coverage, but it does even out on two coats where I would say it's fully opaque. I can't imagine people would need more than two coats, but that could just depend on your nail length and application. And while it might sound so silly to say because I know it just looks black on camera, I think in real life I could notice that this is a very, very dark blue where it's not as dark as Nightshade, for example. And rounding out the quad, we have Ivy, which is a deep ivy green. And you guessed it, it is another super dark, richly pigmented Crelly. And I would say it's kind of in between Dahlia and Midnight Ink as far as how dark it is, I guess, where you can definitely tell that it's green, a very, very dark green, but the color is just a little bit more readable, just not as much as Dahlia, but a little bit more than Midnight Ink, for example. And as expected, this was fully opaque in just 2 coats, though I did have to go back and sort of reapply in certain spots because I don't know, the formula just wasn't super even coverage or self-leveling rather. I think it's true for all of the shades where the first coat was a bit streaky, but it did even out in the end. So I really wanted to do a little skittle with this quad just to show you how all the colors look next to each other, especially in natural lighting, just so you have an idea of how readable the colors actually are, since again, they looked black for the most part on camera, but no surprise, in direct sunlight, you can tell the difference easily between these jewel tones. The problem is when you're outside of that, like in bright indirect lighting, they just kind of blend in with each other, especially Nightshade and Midnight Ink, which I have on my middle and ring finger respectively. Like maybe if you look close enough, you can tell that Midnight Ink is a very, very dark blue, but Nightshade to me just kind of looks black, and it gets even worse in lower lighting where now you can add Ivy to that basically looks black category. So like I mentioned before, Dahlia is the only one that sort of maintains its dark red color, but as you saw in direct sunlight, that showed the most visible nail line, so you might want to do a third coat for it. Moving on to comparisons, we're starting with Madhouse and looking at it next to Warped from the Illusions collection this summer. These obviously aren't dupes, but they do have a similar purple and green color shift going on. They're just kind of reversed. But Madhouse is also in a teal base, while Warped is in a black charcoal. The only other somewhat similar shade that it reminded me of was Mooncat's Mad Hatter from the Alice in Wonderland collab. It also has a similar green and purple kind of color combo, but the purple in the background is due to a flaky, so it's a lot larger and more sparse. Next for Radioactive, here it is next to Cracked Polish's Seek to Disrupt, which came out in the summer, I want to say. These do look pretty similar in the bottle, though Cracked does have an extra multi-chrome flaky going on, but similar to Madhouse and Warped, I would say that the colors of these are the inverse of each other. Next for Overload, the closest shade that I had was ILNP's Cityscape, which is a black jelly base filled with hollow micro flakies. So I figured I could still get some of that rainbow sparkle, but to add some of the silver magnetic pigment, I thought to layer dark matter on top of Cityscape, though I think I did a little too thick of a coat here because it just completely covered the hollow sparkle underneath. Maybe if you do a thinner coat, you'll be more successful in using it as a topper, but I decided to try it again with Cirque Chemistry, which is a silver magnetic topper, and I definitely think it looked pretty close. Not an exact dupe, of course, but very similar vibes. Moving on to Electroshock, I wanted to show this one next to Alice from the same Summer Illusions collection, which has a blue and gold magnetic pigment going on, but again, the colors are kind of the reverse, so not dupes. Moving on to Mood Ring, I knew I had to show this next to Flipside from the Illusions collection, which I thought was going to be a lot closer, being a blue and pink magnetic, but it looks a bit more muted in comparison to Mood Ring, which is a bit darker as well. But then I realized that the closer shade is Ethereal's Midsummer's Eve, at least in my collection, because I don't have Cleona's nor Silasyn, which I would guess the Cleona is maybe more similar to Ethereal, where they have a smaller, more finer background blue shimmer that's a little bit darker as well. So they're not exact dupes to Mood Ring, but very close. And lastly, I did want to show this next to Last Call, which is not a magnetic, it's just a large shimmer particle type of finish, but I thought the colors really reminded me of Mood Ring, being a beautiful blend of blue, purple, and pink, though on the nail and even in the bottle, I think you can tell that Last Call is just deeper and a lot more vibrant. Moving on to Distorted, I wanted to show this next to Misfit, even though that one is a red kind of pinky base color, so there's no blue in it at all, but it does have a very similar, if not the same, orange shimmer in here, so that's kind of like the through line with these polishes, including Hypnosis, which again released in the Illusions collection this summer. I would say that one is more similar to Distorted compared to Misfit, but I still wouldn't call it a dupe. The magnetic is a lighter shade of blue, and the base is more purple. Moving on to the Thorns collection, here is Dahlia next to Currant and Adored, which I think are the two darkest berry reds from ILNP that I have. But as you can see, they are nowhere near as dark as Dahlia is. So even though that one's described as a maroon, I do think it is a little bit berry leaning. If anything, I would say the closest shade that I have to this is Cracked Polish's Red, which is a very deep blood red kind of Crelly leaning shade. Here they are in one coat each, where you can see they have a very similar formula, but you can also tell the difference in undertone, where again, Dahlia is a little bit more berry leaning. But on two coats, you can see that Dahlia gets a bit darker than Red, though I don't think it gets as dark as Holo Taco's Devil's Advocate, which, sorry, I don't have to compare. Next for Nightshade, I first pulled out Vanity, which is a very deep royal purple jelly. Even though it's filled with hollow flakies, I just thought the purple was going to be close, but it's very noticeably purple. So for an even darker shade, I remembered I had Annabelle, which I would describe as a blackened purple. So here on the first coat, you can see again the difference in their coverage, where Vanity and Annabelle are more true jellies, more glassy and translucent, and even though they do build up in color and intensity in the second coat, I feel like you can still tell that they are both purple compared to Nightshade, but Annabelle is pretty close in color. And while this might be silly, I just wanted to see Nightshade next to Ink, which is a pure black cream, because I just thought Nightshade was so incredibly dark. So here's two coats of each. Obviously not dupes. I mean, hopefully you can kind of tell that slightly purple color in Nightshade, but it is definitely very, very dark. And since this is a super dark purple Crelly, I figured I could show it next to one of Cirque's darkest purple jellies. I think it's Royal Jelly that's the darkest and also the most similar in undertone. But as I said, that one is a jelly, so it has a much more glassy, translucent formula. Here they are in one coat each, so you can see the difference in their pigmentation. If you like the color of Nightshade in one coat, I think two coats of Cirque's Royal Jelly is kind of close, maybe a little lighter. You could also do a third coat to deepen the color, but still tell that it's purple. Moving on to Midnight Ink, the darkest ILNP shades that I have were Set Sail and You Up. Again, both of those are more true jelly bases filled with hollow flakies, so they're not exact dupes. But between these two, I would say that You Up is a little bit closer in color to Midnight Ink. In comparison, Set Sail almost looks like it has an indigo sort of quality to it, but it's still very much blue. I think Midnight Ink and You Up just have a slightly more peacock color maybe, but I do think it's strongest in Midnight Ink. So even though that one's described as a navy, I would say that You Up is the most true navy kind of color. I definitely think Midnight Ink is much closer to shades like Cracked Polish's Midnight Phase or Olive's Signature. Midnight Phase is a jelly kind of finish, so it is closer than Signature, which is a true cream. Not to mention that one is a bit lighter and brighter as well. But on the first coat, you can tell that they do have that same kind of undertone going on. So color-wise, I think Signature is a little bit closer to Midnight Ink. It's just kind of hard to tell because Midnight Phase does get very deep like Midnight Ink. So basically the ILNP is like a blend of these two. And of course, here's Midnight Ink next to Cirque's Midnight Jelly and Indigo Jelly, which are two of the darkest Cirque blue jellies that I have. Obviously, the Cirque jellies are more glassy and translucent, so they're not really going to compare to Midnight Ink unless you do 2 or 3 coats of them compared to the 1 coat of the ILNP, because again, it's just so incredibly pigmented. But color-wise, I think I would say that Indigo is a bit closer without being an exact dupe. So similar to some previous comparisons, if you like the color of the ILNP in the 1 coat, you might as well just do 2 or maybe 3 coats of the Cirque. And lastly for Ivy, here it is next to Pine, which is the other dark green in ILNP's studio color line, but that one is a lot brighter, a little bit more emerald in color. Unfortunately, the closest Cirque jelly that I have is Verdigris, which I think is just the closest in their catalog. That one's obviously a lot more teal. They just don't have a true dark green like this. So I would say the closest dark green Crellie that I have is Holo Taco's Feral Forest, which isn't as dark as Ivy is. It is a shade or two lighter. Though on the first coat, they do look kind of similar color-wise, but you can see just how much more pigmented Holo Taco is, really pushing the line into being a cream. But again, Ivy basically catches up on the second coat. So that wraps up my swatches and comparisons for ILNP's Twisted and Thorns collections. As always, I cannot wait to hear what you think of these releases. Starting with the Twisted collection, I generally do really like them because I am a big fan of ILNP's magnetics in the first place. I feel like they strike a really great balance between having these slightly jelly-leaning bases, which really allow them to magnetize super easily, while also being very, very pigmented and easily opaque in two coats. Again, maybe with the exception of Electroshock, which for some reason was just a lot more sheer than the others. So yeah, overall, I did really enjoy that collection. I thought it was just so beautiful, so colorful. There's something about multi-chromes and magnetics especially that just feel very fitting for spooky season, at least for me. But I totally understand people having magnetic fatigue, especially since ILNP just gave us another full piece magnetic collection in the summer. So this is kind of like a 2.0 version. So definitely let me know if you're feeling these or not. But yeah, overall, I do like them, and I would say that they are my favorite release out of the two, because unfortunately, when it comes to Thorns, I don't want to say that I didn't like them or that I think they're bad polishes. It's not that. On the contrary, I feel like I have been begging for ILNP to release these dark jewel tone kind of shades in their studio color line. So this is kind of what I was asking for, but I don't think I'm alone in saying that these are just so dark. So it obviously comes down to a more personal preference kind of thing, where I don't really wear black polish to begin with, but I feel like if I was somebody who wore black exclusively, or, you know, black adjacent shades, I would really, really love these, because at first glance, they are so incredibly dark, but then when you see them in like the right lighting, you can actually tell that they are a different color. But more often than not, I'm just kind of annoyed by polishes that are so dark they almost look black in most lighting, which I feel like is definitely the case for Nightshade. That is the top one, followed closely by Midnight Ink, where, you know, I can kind of tell that it is blue, but if you are just like inside in lower or like dim kind of lighting, it's going to be really hard to tell them apart. I do wish they were slightly lighter, I guess, similar to Dahlia, where again, that one I think just has the easiest time reading that it is still a dark, dark red. And even aside from the color aspect, the other thing that kind of annoys me with them is that they have these Crellie kind of finishes, because at least I have mentioned it before that whenever a Crellie is so dark, it just might as well be a cream at that point, because you just kind of lose all the squishiness and glassiness. Even though these did admittedly dry down pretty shiny, and especially in direct sunlight, you can tell that there is a little bit of that squishiness there. But again, in like most lighting, it's just so dark that they kind of just look like creams. So unfortunately, that one isn't my favorite collection, which is a shame, because I do love the concept. I love like the marketing for that collection too, but yeah, for me, it's just a little too dark. But of course, let me know what you all think down below so we can chat about it. But thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!